Alright, welcome back. For the first part of this video, we're going to talk about a few tips and tricks to get you started on the road to embossing your tin can project. So embossing is just basically means pressing into or carving into the surface of something to create a relief. And relief just means that something sticks out. So basically embossing is pressing into this metal to just make parts of it stick out or make marks into the metal. So what we're going to try and do is practice on these little test strips some techniques that might really work for you when making your project. So my first test, I'm just going to play around with a shape, and I don't have embossing tools. If you do, you can use them, that's great. So I'm going to use a combination of a ballpoint pen, maybe a pencil, and the back side of this Sharpie. So what's really important with any kind of embossing is you need a flat surface, but you also need something that is soft. So if you have a piece of foam, you can use that. I'm going to use a magazine, and the reason is when we press into the metal, it needs a soft surface to kind of create those indents. If you try and emboss on a hard surface like wood, you're not going to get as nice of an effect. I'm going to start out making a tiny test template by just pressing into the metal and starting by mark making. Here is where the embossing gets interesting. I've gone over my lines a couple of times, pressing fairly firmly because I really want that embossing to pop out when I flip this over. So you can just make marks because this is just a test one. On your good copy, you would sort of plan out your design a little bit better, but for now, I'm just sort of practicing. So I've made these marks on one side fairly hard. Now this is where things get fun. You flip it over, and you can see that my lines are starting to pop out, but I really want them to jump out. That's what makes this a true embossing. So what I need to do now is flip this over and then use something. If you have a blending stump for drawing, you can. I'm not sure what's going to work best, so I'm going to try and press with just a pencil eraser, and I'm kind of pressing the opposite way, and what that's going to do is push down the centerpiece, really helping those lines that I drew to really like pop out on this embossing. So by pushing down the center, I'm forcing those lines that I made to really stick out, and you can see it's starting to work. Looks good. Now that we've done our test embossing, I think we can move forward with our good copy template. For using a template, you want a piece of paper that's slightly larger than the piece of tin, and then you want to fold it around the edges just to give you an idea of what size you'll actually need to do your drawing. Next, I've just removed the piece of metal from behind my paper, and I am going to create my drawing. When you're creating your drawing, keeping in mind that with embossing, the more detail, the more lines, the more dots, the more things you have going on in your drawing, the more interesting your final product will be. I've finished my, let's call it a good copy drawing for the purpose of practicing this embossing, and I think this will work nice. There's some empty space, but there's enough details that I'm going to end up with a really nice final result. So the next step is to get embossing. So now we can go ahead and get started with tracing our drawing onto our metal and see what happens. So I have pressed into my embossing. I've traced over my entire design, and I'm going to remove the paper, and I know I pressed a little bit too hard in some spots because I actually ended up ripping my design a little bit, which is okay. So you can see now that because I traced through the paper, my embossing is actually really quite light. So the next step is going to be to go over this again, because I really want my embossing to show up really well when I flip it over. Here we have it, my doubly traced embossing. So let's flip it over and have a look. Oh man, that looks really great. So the last and final step to kind of completing this embossing will be to, again, go in between the lines that I've traced on the other side, and you can use a pencil eraser, you can use, you know, a retracted pen to really get in there, but you want to kind of reverse stretch the metal. And as you can see by pushing in there, what that's doing is that's making these lines really, really pop forward. There you have it. What I would call a finished embossing. I'm really happy with how it turned out. You can see it's got some really nice texture. It really pops off the page or the piece of tin. It really, really sticks out. So I've got a lot of really good relief action happening here. So this is kind of what you can expect in your final piece, whatever you end up doing with it. So at this point you could cut it out and turn it into a mixed media piece. If you were making smaller tiles, you could turn it into jewelry. If you were doing a larger one, you could put more than one can together. There is just one final technique that I want to show you, and that involves how you can put color into this if you want, using different types of markers. When we're talking about using color to finish off an embossing, you can think about this two different ways. You can use a regular marker, sort of like a Crayola or a washable marker, or you could use a Sharpie. You could also use paint, I suppose, if you wanted, but the difference is if you use a Sharpie, it goes on to your embossing, to the foil. It covers really nice, you get some really nice color, but it becomes pretty permanent pretty fast. You can't really wipe it off. The difference being if you use a regular marker or like a Crayola style marker, you don't necessarily get quite as nice coverage. The color is still actually pretty good, but the difference is you have a little bit of time and you can still, you can actually wipe this off. So you can see it comes off pretty quick in comparison to the Sharpie, which is pretty permanent. So when you're coloring, just sort of be aware, depending on what you want your final result to be, what kind of markers you're going to use. What you can also do if you're using these non-permanent or Crayola markers, you can actually use them to create a bit of a texture. So I'm going to just color in a little section here. And then I'm going to take my paper towel and just sort of like blot it a little bit off. And so what ends up happening is I end up with some kind of almost like a patina in the texture of my embossing. So I guess it just depends on what result you're going for, what materials you might use. The end result is pretty great. The color is good, the embossing is good. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. Of course, the color is optional. You don't have to put it, but it does add a little bit of fun, especially if you're making something wearable or something that you might hang. It is nice to have a little bit of color in there. So I hope you enjoyed this and you find the tips useful when you're making your own embossing from pop can tin.